Some of you are on, I'll just make a quick announcement. Some of you are on our, most of you are probably on our mailing list. Today we sent out a brief news flash of a newsletter, which we've never done before. And if people have read the New York Times today and other major international news, the International Energy and Atomic Group, part of the UN in Austria, in Vienna, today confirmed that Iran has processed enough nuclear materials. I'm not a nuclear expert or a physicist, but it's enough to create, they have the materials now to create a bomb. And it doesn't mean that they have the capacity to make a bomb or to deliver a bomb, but they have now some of the materials, needed materials to create a bomb. So this is another benchmark that has passed. And it's, as somebody studying anti-Semitism in the contemporary context, I find it astounding that the world is silent. And we are, collectively as students, as scholars, as leaders, as intellectuals, we're by and large silent. And we are, I don't know if it's the postmodernist malaise, but all of us are sort of deconstructing away the problem. And the problem is only getting worse. And I hope, as a scholar, that people will take interest in this in terms of the intellectual research and responding to it. And I think as concerned citizens, not only responding to genocidal anti-Semitism, but the lack of this group that is bent on destroying Israel, the lack of removing citizenship and basic human rights from other groups, religious minorities, the gay community, dissidents. And it's just unbelievable that we, intellectuals in the West, have basically acquiesced to this challenge. And I hope maybe with this passing of another benchmark, we'll have responses. So, in light of this, it's really an honor to introduce to you today Paul Iganski. Today he'll be speaking about, the title of his lecture is entitled Playing the Nazi Card, Antisemitic Discourse Against Israel. Professor Iganski is he's a professor of criminology at Lancaster University. He was formerly at the University of Essex for many years, and he researched methods and methodology in the area of crime and human rights and cultural criminology. He is on the editorial board of Journals of the Patterns of Prejudice, a well-known and old established journal in London. His areas of research include hate, violence, human rights, racial stratification, and equal opportunities. He's been a visiting scholar. There's a strange noise today. It's the second time. He's been a visiting scholar at the Brunswick Center for Research on Conflict and Violence at Northeastern University in Boston. He was appointed as a Civil Society Fellow at the Institute for Jewish and Policy Research in London. And just interesting as a side story, one of the first meetings I had when we had the idea of establishing ISGAP, which was the precursor to YIISA. ISGAP is the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. And it so happened that I was in London and I met with Paul and Barry Cosman at the center. And they were one of the first people who I spoke to about establishing the center, and they were one of the first people who were very encouraging me, they encouraged me greatly to try and establish it. So it's wonderful that you're here giving a seminar, and it wasn't so many years ago. Paul has also served on the editorial board of Sociology, and he's written many newspaper articles and magazine articles for the International Herald Tribune, the Jewish Forward, Haaretz, the Jewish Chronicle in London, and the list goes on. He's been an expert analyst for the BBC, for Time magazine, and for the Sydney Morning Herald newspaper. Paul received his BA at Goldsmiths College, a master's from Manchester University, and he did his PhD in social policy at the London School of Economics. He's written widely, and just hold up a brand new book off the press. If people are interested, we have some material. It's called Hate Crimes and the City. It's a brand new book that was just published by Polity Press. He's written Criminology, a Sociological Introduction, and he wrote an important book in 2003 on the new anti-Semitism. He and his colleagues in London were one of the first people actually writing on this new anti-Semitism. So it's an honor that you're here.
Thank you. Thank you for that terrific introduction. I just wish my Miller was here to hear that. Thank you. Perhaps if I just say one or two things about myself before I start. Charles mentioned that I was a Civil Society Fellow at the Institute for Jewish Policy Research. That was between 2000 and 2005, which was an honorary position, but I directed their Civil Society Research Programme. I think I was the only Gentile involved with the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, and I left I resigned my fellowship in 2005 because of various complicated communal politics over the Institute. And perhaps if you want to draw me out in the discussion, I will say more about that. And the presentation that I'm going to give to you today has also not been immune from politics. And if I can just explain, this presentation is being given not quite in Chatham House rules. A video is being made of it, but my sponsors, I'm going to talk about some commissioned research, but my sponsors have said that I can't name them at this point until everything goes public. The video won't be online until everything goes public, and I can't put a paper online until everything goes public, so you will have to hang on my words today, if that's okay. If you forgive me for that. And finally, I have a script in front of me, but don't worry, I'm not going to read it all out. It's a script for a 2-hour presentation. Charles suggested to me I might want to try 30 minutes. 40. Or 40 minutes, okay. And so, towards the end of my presentation, I will just refer to my scripts because I've got some complicated twists and turns, and it's helpful if I can remember them and keep on message. But the early part of my presentation, I'll be off script. So that's how it will go. But when you see me turn to the script, if it does sound that I'm reading out, please wave at me or say something, because as you'll know, there's nothing more boring than that. So I'll begin. Does that sound okay to you if I make a start? Okay. Well, the starting point for my presentation is just to talk about the commissioning of this research. And I can't mention at this point who has commissioned and sponsored this particular research project. But this particular research project that I'm going to talk to you about follows on from these two particular pieces of work. First of all, you might have heard about the all-parliamentary inquiry into anti-Semitism that was held in the UK in 2005-2006. That report on the left was published in 2006, and I was one of the people who gave expert testimony before the MPs to that inquiry, and I gave testimony on anti-Semitic incidents. And also interesting, not being Jewish myself, I've also been the target of anti-Semitic incidents because people assume that I'm Jewish for various reasons. Again, if you want to draw me out on that in the discussion afterwards, there's plenty I could say about that. Now, in that report of the all-parliamentary inquiry, one of the key chapters in that report concerned anti-Semitic discourse, and the inquiry drew attention to a number of key themes of anti-Semitic discourse and called for more research, more understanding in the area. The second report was published this year, just a few months ago, as Antisemitic Discourse in 2007. It covers all the 2007 calendar year, published by the Community Security Trust. Have people heard of that, the British organisation? It's a communal organisation that's primarily concerned with defensive measures around synagogues, Jewish schools, communal facilities, and so on. They normally produce an annual report of anti-Semitic incidents and analysis of anti-Semitic incidents. For the first time this year, they've produced this Antisemitic Discourse report, which takes the analysis from the parliamentary inquiry much further, going into many more themes. And my work follows on from these, whereas those first two are largely describing the problem of anti-Semitic discourse. My task has been to analyse the problem and propose some policy solutions for it. So that's what I'm going to present to you in the next 30 minutes. So, does that sound reasonable? For me to continue? Okay, thank you. Well, I'm focusing on one dominant style of anti-Semitic discourse, one dominant theme that I've called playing the Nazi card. And in beginning to talk about that theme, I'd just like to introduce it by thinking about three issues that, that concern us in terms of the analysis. First of all, there's the problem of defining anti-Semitism. And as you'll know, there's no textbook definition of anti-Semitism. It's, as with all concepts, it's a contested concept. But there is some clustering of agreement now by national governments and Jewish communal organisations around the European Union Monitoring Centre, now called the Fundamental Agency for Fundamental Rights in Europe, around the working definition of anti-Semitism. And are some of you familiar with that definition? And in that definition, they argue that one of the defining characteristics of anti-Semitism may be, much of the definition is fudged, may be and can be the drawing of parallels between the Israeli state and Nazi Germany. So this definition that's now semi-official is recognising that such parallels can be anti-Semitic. I would argue, though, that labelling the anti-Semitic discourse as anti-Semitic, and some of you in the discussion afterwards might take contention with me about this when I try to present the early thinking about this to the Board of Deputies of British Jews. I didn't get much further than this next point before I had interruptions, and then we got into a discussion and question and answer session from the audience. One of the key arguments that I'm making is that much of the debate around anti-Semitism and contemporary anti-Semitism has resulted in an intellectual cul-de-sac of claim and counterclaim. And you may or may not agree with me about this. That the problem of labelling has taken us down into a discursive dead end, for which there seems to be little way out. And in this research, I've been looking for a discursive way out of this intellectual cul-de-sac. And I think that we have lined up over the debate of contemporary anti-Semitism, critics and their detractors. And we have this cul-de-sac, a war of words about the meaning of anti-Semitism. And I'll say a bit more about that in my presentation. Instead, what I'm trying to do in this research is shift to the consequences of anti-Semitic discourse. So rather than labelling and defining the problem anti-Semitism, which I argue is problematic, so moving beyond the labelling and definition to looking at the consequences. And that's the shift that I'm trying to make. And I think many people are still stuck in this cul-de-sac of labelling and naming the problem, which really isn't going to get us too far. Now, I'd like to just, before I proceed, talk about what I mean by discourse, because there are various interpretations of it, and don't worry, I'm not going to go into Foucault and give you a very deep definition of it. The notion of discourse that I'm going to use represents communicative action. Communicative action, and that's communication expressed in speech, communication expressed in visual symbols, all sorts of visual symbols such as graffiti, daubings, artwork, cartoon caricatures, and other forms of visual expression. So I'm using the term discourse to represent communicative action of visual and oral forms. Does that make sense to you? It seemed to come out of my mouth a little convoluted, but it does seem to make sense. Okay. Well, with this preparatory work, I can now get into the heart of my analysis. What does playing the Nazi card involve? I'm sure this will be familiar to all of you, what I'm talking about. but you might not have articulated it exactly in the terms that I'm putting it to you. And here I will read through my script, where playing the Nazi card refers to the use of Nazi or related terms or symbols, Nazism, Hitler, swastikas, etc., in relation to Jews, Israel, Zionism, or aspects of the Jewish experience. So it's using the word Nazi or Nazi symbolism in relation to Jews, Israel, Zionism. I'm sure you'll be familiar with many instances of this. It's usually targeted against Jews individually or collectively, and for the purposes of the argument that I want to put to you out the consequences, shifting the debate onto the consequences, argue that it scratches deep wounds by invoking painful collective memory of the Holocaust. More often than not, playing the Nazi card involves hurtful and explicit insults and abuse, but, and this is the contentious and problematic issue, provocative comparisons between the brutal and genocidal actions of the Nazis and the policies and practices of the Israeli state. And, as I said a few moments ago, in how I'm interpreting discourse, playing the Nazi card manifests in words uttered in speech, or in writing, or in visual representations such as artwork, drawings, caricatures, cartoons, graffitis, daubings, scratches, visual expressions such as a Nazi salute or the clicking of heels. And I'm sure you all know what I mean by this kind of symbolism and expression. So that's what I'm talking about in talking about playing the Nazi card. And I'm going to focus on three key themes. Three things are going to structure my discussion now. Playing the Nazi card as abuse against Jews. It's a rather straightforward one to talk about. And I'll be off my script here and just give you a few instances of that. Secondly, the Nazi card as abuse against the collective memory of the Holocaust. I think that's quite a straightforward one. I'll be off script. But I think I need to go through the analytical footwork of the first two themes to get onto the third one, because this really is the issue at the heart of the matter. That's when the Nazi card is manifest in discourse about Israel and Zionism. So the three things. Are you ready for me to start working through them? Okay, here's the first one on the Nazi card as abuse against Jews. Okay. You can see that I'm just rapidly going through my script here. This one is very straightforward. Little contention about this. Where the Nazi card is used in explicit, hateful abuse against Jews. The many incidents recorded by the Community Security Trust annually. Incidents that come to mind that I talk about in the report on this research. The one that I can't show you as yet. The type of incidents recorded are swastikas daubed on the walls of synagogues, Jewish schools, offensive voicemail messages left on synagogues, the type of thing that come to mind, things that I've looked at in police records, are things such as Hitler was right, and you know the type of thing that people say. Incidents of abuse on the street. In my analysis of anti-Semitic crimes, anti-Semitic hate crime on the street, we can see the word Nazi abuse used against victims, students in their dormitories and on campus, swastikas scratched on a university student's door, for instance, in their hall of residence. All of these examples, I haven't made them up, but they come from crime reports and from the Community Security Trust reports. I've just given you a snapshot of them. I'm sure you'll be familiar with these types of incidents. I'm just going over them very quickly. Now, in the UK, and it's the same in the United States as I understand it, where these incidents involve criminal incidents, daubing a swastika on a synagogue door in Britain is an act of criminal damage. Throwing any paint on a synagogue door would be an act of criminal damage, and probably won't be punishable by a £1,000 fine maximum if it was a first-time offender. Under Britain's so-called hate crime laws, that swastika would turn it into a racially aggravated act of criminal damage. In the US it would be called a hate crime, and the offender would get a higher penalty, probably a £2,000 fine. And so the extra penalty there is for the sentiment associated with the crime, the racist, anti-Semitic sentiment accompanying the crime. And that's how hate crime laws work. Are you fairly familiar with the way the law, and they work that way in the United States? Now, I'd just like to think briefly what it is, why is it that such offences attract a higher penalty under the criminal law? It's because of the consequences. It's not a matter of offending people's sensibilities, but it's because of the hurts, the hurtful consequences inflicted by the anti-Semitic, or with racist incidents, the racist aggravation behind them. Research evidence clearly shows, and I show some of that in my book, Hate Crimes in the City. Look at evidence of the British Crime Survey, people who've reported racist incidents, and compare them, people who've reported crimes that weren't racially motivated, and you compare racist against non-racially motivated crimes, you find the victims of such incidents reporting higher levels of post-traumatic stress type symptoms, anxiety, depression, sleeplessness, emotional disorders, and so on. These incidents, when they're targeted at an individual, the survey evidence not only shows that they have a negative emotional impact upon the individual, they also have a terroristic impact upon the communities, and there's a particular resonance there in the case of Jewish communities and using the swastika that I'm sure I don't need to vocalise here. And they also have a wider impact upon community cohesion and commitment to equality and so on. Now these harms are recognised by legislatures in the United States and in Britain. I won't say much more about that. I do say a lot more about that in my script. But the key point is that offenders in these types of incidents are punished more harshly, not because of their opinion or their values, but because of the consequences, because of the hurts they inflict. And increasingly we can empirically document those hurts. There's a very interesting incident reported in the Jewish Chronicle about 6 months ago, where a Jewish shopkeeper in North London called the police because another Jewish shopkeeper, his neighbour, called him a Nazi. He used some more profane, common profane things, which I won't repeat here, but called him a Nazi. There was a dispute over a footpath outside and who was putting their produce where and so on. Apparently this had gone on for a long time, according to the report in the Jewish Chronicle. Called the police officer. The police officer came along, under British law, would have had to report it as an anti-Semitic incident. Now, this is one Jew calling another Jew a Nazi. And this type of case, I've just given you one case here, you might think of lots of other cases, indicates the hurt involved. So it's not only when the Nazi card is played against Jews by others, but it also hurts. And this shows the depth of the hurt, I would argue, when it's played by Jew against Jew. I could give you a number of examples of these types of incidents around the world. So let me move on to the second theme. These first two themes are my analytical footwork to get into the third one that I really want to focus on in my presentation. My second theme concerns the Nazi card played as abuse against the collective memory of the Holocaust. Holocaust denial is a playing of the Nazi card. It's a prominent example. It's a discursive act against Jews collectively in which the historical memory of the Nazi regime is invoked and used against Jews. And that's why I'm conceptualising it as a playing of the Nazi card. Can you see the point there? That also came out to me as a little bit convoluted, but just to say that again, if I may, briefly. In Holocaust denial, the Nazi card is played in a discursive act against Jews by denying the historical facts of the Holocaust, by promoting the various conspiracy theories of the Holocaust, again, that I'm sure you'll all be familiar with. It's using this historical memory, it's invoking historical memory of the Nazi regime and using it against Jews. So I would argue that Holocaust denial is a discursive act of playing the Nazi card. Now, there are many arguments about why Holocaust denial is problematic. And again, I'm sure that many of you here will be familiar with those arguments. But I want to focus on one key argument, a very earlier argument that has been significant for me in my thinking and is significant for the analysis here. That is, abuse of the collective memory of the Holocaust scratches deep wounds that are not yet healed over. So whilst not many people will question an assertion that distortion and misrepresentation of the historical facts of the Holocaust is insulting and offensive to the memory of those who perished, those who survived and their descendants, the harm of Holocaust denial goes much beyond insult, and it scratches deep wounds that are not yet healed over. Now, this was acknowledged in early legal judgments. I think of the West German, as it was then at the time, the West German state, in one of the very first provisions in Europe against Holocaust denial in the 1970s, where in Germany it's outlawed what's there referred to as the Auschwitz-Lüge or the Auschwitz lie, which prohibits defamation and denigration of deceased persons and aims to protect human dignity. It's made Holocaust denial a criminal offence, one of the first European states to do this. Now, I know that in the United States, in commitment to rights to freedom of expression and so on, there'll be many objections to this type of provision. But could I just share with you some of the legal thinking about why this law was established in West Germany? The West German Federal Supreme Court that finally upheld the provisions, following various legal challenges, concluded the following. Now, I'm quoting here, so I'm sorry, I'm treating you a bit like I treat my students when I'm lecturing. If you can do your best to follow me as I quote this legal judgment. Not the most enticing speech, but try and follow what the West German Federal Supreme Court concluded in 1979. It concluded, quote, that nobody has a protected right to make untrue allegations, end quote. And then it went on to say, quote, whoever tries to deny the truth of past events denies to every Jew the respect to which he is entitled. To the individual affected, this must appear as a continuation of discrimination against his group and therefore indirectly against his person. So the court ruled that an act of Holocaust denial is an ongoing act of discrimination against Jews. And in upholding the injunction against, this was somebody who had painted graffiti, where they, in a wall in Berlin that said the murder of 6 million Jews was a Zionist swindle. The supposed murder of 6 million Jews was a Zionist swindle and a lie. The court upheld the conviction, and it said the following. Again, if you can bear with me on this, then I'll give you a break from these quotes. Quote, not the personal fate, but the historical events are the criterion which weighs upon the personality of every Jew in Germany and upon his personal and social relationship to his German fellow citizens. In my notes I underline this, so I'll try and underline it to you now. The terrible events have formed the personality of the citizens of Jewish origin who embody the past, even if they were not personally part of it. I'll leave the West German Federal Supreme Court there and just put it into my own words. It's a very interesting ruling, a landmark ruling, one of the earliest rulings against Holocaust denial. And criminalisation wasn't because of the offence. It was a conclusion that Holocaust denial is an ongoing act of discrimination. Why? Because the collective memory of the Holocaust is present in Jews in Germany, whether they were survivors, descendants, or descendants of descendants. and that the collective memory of the Holocaust is still very much alive, and therefore Holocaust denial, by invoking that memory and attacking it, scratches very deep wounds indeed that are not yet healed. Now, I would argue that we can extend that reasoning about the hurts and the harms and the consequences inflicted by Holocaust denial to Jews outside of Germany, elsewhere, around the world. And I would also like to say, not only Jews, but to people like myself and people who see the world in the same way. Are you still with me up to this point? Okay. Well, thank you for bearing with me, because now I get into the third part of my presentation, and you'll hear me scrabbling through my notes, through my script here, to deal with the final theme that provides the heart of the analysis and the contentious issue about playing the Nazi card against Israel and Zionism. I would argue that interpreting the Nazi card as abuse against Jews and the harms involved there is unproblematic. Few people would question or take issue with what I've said. Likewise, I think not many people would take issue with what I've said about the consequences and the hurts when the Nazi card is played as abuse against collective memory of the Holocaust. However, many people would take issue, and this is why we focused on the topic. Many people would take issue when we talk about the Nazi card manifest in discourse about Israel and Zionism. So I'm going to focus on this in a little bit of depth. This is one of the most challenging components of anti-Semitic discourse in general. In this case, playing the Nazi card involves equating the Israeli state collectively, or the state embodied by its leaders or its military practices, with Nazis, Nazi Germany, genocidal actions of the Nazi regime. I'm assuming that you're all familiar with these types of things. You've seen cartoons, you've read press reports, you've heard statements of people. Can I just give you a few examples? If we look at debates in the United Nations, there's some very contemporary examples there, coming from representatives of Syria and Lebanon. But to take me close to my home in the UK, you might have heard about Labour MP Una King in 2003. Following a visit to Gaza, wrote a commentary in The Guardian, sort of left of centre, very serious newspaper, read by academics like me, in which she said, quote, "The original founders of the Jewish state could surely not imagine the irony facing Israel today, and escaping the ashes of the Holocaust, they have incarcerated another people in a hell similar in its nature, though not in its extent, to the Warsaw Ghetto." Conservative MP Andrew Dismore, in the House of Commons in 2003, claimed that in the conflict in Lebanon, Israel was using the tactics of the Nazis between 1939 and 40. Blitzkrieg and strafing civilians, according to Andrew Dismore MP. He actually apologised about it afterwards, about using such language. 2007, prominent scholar Hilary Rose, one of the leaders of the academic boycott movement in Britain, stated in an article in the Guardian newspaper that the proposed boycott, that Gaza had become, quote, a vast concentration camp. I could go on and on with examples. These are not just isolated examples. Many, many examples I could present to you from Britain and around the world. And just last week at Goldsmiths College, the University of London, where I did my first on my undergraduate degree, and Charles was once a professor there. An event was held, well-attended event, supported by the Students' Union, in which Gaza was compared to the Warsaw Ghetto. So I think you get the picture. It looks like you do from the notes from some of you. Now, this is a potentially powerful discursive strategy. If you think about it, it's a very powerful discursive strategy, because anything associated with the Nazis is condemned with unconditional moral indignation in most contemporary Western societies and many societies elsewhere. Playing the Nazi card, therefore, it brands the object, brands the target, brands the object of the accusation with the stigma of absolute evil. As a discursive act, it has parallels with playing the Nazi card against identifiable persons in specific abuse, the things I related to in beginning my talk, because identifiable entities, Israeli political leaders, the Israeli state, symbols of the state such as the Israeli flag are targeted. So it's like, in a way, painting a synagogue on a swastika dome. So that symbols of the state are targeted with this abuse. And it also has clear parallels with discourses that abuse the collective historical memory of the Holocaust, because some claim that when the Nazi card is played against Israel and Zionism, it targets Jews collectively, Jews as a collectivity. So I would argue that when the Nazi card is played against Israel and Zionism, it has clear parallels with these rather uncontentious types of playing the Nazi card. Now, some commentators have argued that this particular variant of the Nazi card is a form of Holocaust inversion, whereby victims are cast as the perpetrators. Gabrielle Schoenfield has described this as an extraordinary reversal, breathtaking way in which the victims of Nazism have been transformed into Nazis themselves by a distortion that is every bit as distant from historical reality and every bit as slanderous of Jewish memory as the work of Holocaust deniers. Some have claimed, without hesitation, that when the Nazi card is played against the Israeli state, its leaders, its military practices, or its founding ideology of Zionism, it's clearly anti-Semitic. Now with that claim, there we get into the problem and the war of words about this issue, and the reason for this research project, and the heart of the analysis. And you might be familiar with this war of words that has broken out over the matter, and the intellectual cul-de-sac that I would, as I would characterise it, where those who, against those who claim that the playing of the Nazi card against the Israeli state and also Zionism is anti-Semitic, some argue that they have to speak loudly, they have to speak trenchantly to get their concerns heard. A number of prominent Jews, and some in Britain, have played the Nazi card in this way, and they argue, how can they be anti-Semitic? They are speaking loudly to express their own concerns, and this is one way of getting their concerns heard. And they further argue that the label anti-Semitism is being slung against them as a card against them. An anti-Semitism card is being played against those who sling the Nazi card, to intimidate them into silence and to suppress their criticism of the Israeli state, and if it's the Zionist project in general, of Zionism in general. I'm sure you're familiar with this type of debate that's going on. And it's going, I'd argue, going round and round and round. He said, she said, name calling, and that's the level that the debate has been up to this point. Now, I would suggest that we need a way out of this, and focusing...
Not mine.
That's not me. I think it must be a cab passing by again. I'll keep going. That focusing on the hurts and the consequences is rather more productive, and it takes us away from some of the politicking and finds a discursive way out of this matter. And in the last 5 minutes, can you take 5 more minutes from me? Okay. What I normally say to my students, and forgive me for, I'm not really treating all my students, but I find myself repeating myself. I normally say to them that at this stage of a presentation, this is where I need your attention most of all, and when you're least able to give it to me. So please try your best in this last 5 minutes. And you'll see that I'm referring to my script. If it sounds like I'm reading, just say something to me. and I'll come off the script. I'd argue that it's neither useful nor necessary to try to get inside the heads of those who use such discourse against Israel and Zionism, those who compare the Israeli state, Israel's leaders, etc., with Nazis in Nazi Germany. It's neither useful nor necessary to try to get inside their heads and argue that they're anti-Semitic, debate whether they're anti-Semitic, allege that they're anti-Semitic. That's just taking us into that cul-de-sac and keeping us in the cul-de-sac, because it's the consequences of the words that they use that matter. Abhorrence and protest against the policies, practices and leaders of the Israeli state can be expressed in numerous forceful and trenchant ways, as they can against any other state, none of which would be anti-Semitic. But when criticism is voiced by playing the Nazi card and drawing parallels with the genocidal, eliminationist atrocities committed by the Nazi regime, then many Jews and non-Jews who view Israel and Zionism as central to Jewish identity will regard the discourse as unquestionably anti-Semitic. Many of those who engage in such discourse would deny the accusation of anti-Semitism. And you've probably heard such denials. Indeed, some will not be motivated by hatred or animus towards Jews, or have anti-Semitic intentions. Their motivation might be to draw attention to their concerns about human rights abuses and the excesses and casualties of war. As Richard Falk, does some of you know the statements of Richard Falk on this matter? And that's what he claimed. That's why, and when he admitted that his choice of words was somewhat insensitive, he was again arguing that he had to speak loudly to get his concerns heard. Well, as with the other variants, the two variants of the Nazi card that I've mentioned, irrespective, and this is my key point, irrespective of whether it's labelled anti-Semitic, such discourse has consequences. And it's the consequences, not the anti-Semitism, I would argue, that matters. And these consequences, whether intended or not. The fact that perpetrators of incidents against Jews, on the streets for instance, are far less discriminating in their sentiments than those who play the Nazi card against the Israeli state might claim, might give the latter pause for thought about their responsibilities that accompany their right to express criticism in a particular way. My analysis of hate crimes against Jews, I carried out an analysis of hate crimes against Jews reported to London's Metropolitan Police Service. There are quite a number of cases where offenders did Nazi salutes, Sieg Heil, this type of thing, said disgraceful things about the Holocaust to their victims when they were targeting them. And therefore, because such offenders are generally not very sophisticated in their thinking, not very nuanced, those who use this type of discourse against the Israeli state, even though they might claim good intentions, there should be good enough reason for pause for thought about the responsibilities of their discourse. Furthermore, when some critics play the Nazi card, it's played in such a way that it would involve splitting very fine hairs indeed to decide whether or not their words demonise all Jews collectively, or they are targeting specific policies and practices of the Israeli state. They have a responsibility too to consider the impact of the words that they use. Now, playing the Nazi card against Israel as a state clearly demonises the state in the minds of many people who encounter such discourse. But the fundamental issue at stake, concerning the question of whether playing the Nazi card against Israel and Zionism demonises all Jews collectively and is therefore anti-Semitic, depends upon the degree to which Israel and Zionism are viewed as essential components of Jewish identity. Sounded to me as if I was reading from my script there, so I'm going to come off script and finish off with a few words about this. That for those people for whom Israel is fundamental to Jewish identity, playing the Nazi card against Israel and the demonisation it involves will be seen as an assault against the core of Jewish identity. And it's likely to be seen to defame and demonise all Jews as a collectivity. And so those people who see Jews and non-Jews as Israel and Zionism as being at the heart of Jewish identity, playing the Nazi card against the Israeli state, will be seen to be defaming the heart, defaming Jewish identity, unquestionably anti-Semitic. For those for whom Israel and Zionism are not fundamental to Jewish identity, then demonisation of Israel may solely be regarded as an attack on Israel as a state and not on Israel as the collective Jew. Let me just give you an example of this latter perspective. Anthony Lerman, for instance, the current executive director of the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, where I have my fellowship, and where I resigned in 2005, and Tony Lerman took over from my collaborator Barry Cosmin at the time, argued the following. For decades, Zionism was supported by only a minority of Jews. The rest were either indifferent or manifestly opposed to the whole idea of the Jewish state. Anti-Zionism was therefore a perfectly respectable position to hold, and one that continues to be held today by hundreds of thousands of strictly Orthodox Jews and many secular Jews with left liberal perspectives. From this perspective, the problem then, for another critic, Jenny Bourne, who is one of the editors of a radical left journal in Britain, academic journal, Race and Class, argued that it's the supporters of Israel, not Israel's critics, who conflate Jewry in the state of Israel, I'm quoting her here, who conflate Jewry in the state of Israel, which in turn enables them to claim that any Nazi metaphor applied to Israel applies equally to Jews. Jenny Bourne is arguing that it's the supporters of Israel who are creating the problem by conflating Israel with Jewish identity. And therefore, that's where they're leading us into this argument that playing the Nazi card against Israel is anti-Semitic, where Bourne will clearly, the implication will be that it's not. Well, and you might be pleased that I'm finishing off here, and this is really where I need maximum attention from you, in my closing words. Then I look forward to comments and questions from you. These types of arguments that I've just cited and quoted to you, unfortunately, I would argue these types of arguments and the counter-arguments against them have led down an intellectual cul-de-sac with a consequent need for new thinking of the type that we're looking to find a way out of this cul-de-sac. The point is, this is the point is that labelling the playing of the Nazi card against Israel and Zionism as anti-Semitic, even though it's perceived by many to be so, leads to a discursive dead end. The matter at stake, and the matter that more people will be more certain about, is that the playing of the Nazi card in this way hurts. It hurts by invoking painful collective memories for Jews, and by using those memories against them, and it hurts Jews irrespective of whether they perceive Israel and Zionism to be essential to their Jewish identity. That's what we argue. The harmful consequences of equating Israel to Nazi Germany will be obvious to most people. Deep wounds are scratched hard. It's hardly a cause for wonder then that the motives of those who engage in such discourse, even if they are Jews themselves, will be questioned. Given the obvious hurts inflicted, they should know better. Well, to finish off, in the last minute or so, actually, could I take 2 minutes? Okay. 3, thank you. So if Charles is okay with that, I will take 3 minutes, thank you. I've discussed 3 different variants of playing the Nazi card. I've given you very brief overviews of them, and when you read the published version, when it comes into the public domain, hopefully If you're interested, you'll read about the twists and turns of the analysis in far more detail. But in brief, these three variants of playing the Nazi card, apart from the fact that the Nazi card is involved there, the one fundamental common denominator between them, apart from the invocation of painful collective memories of the Nazi atrocities, is that they all result in harmful consequences. They all result in harmful consequences, whether we conclude that they're anti-Semitic or not. The most contentious of the three variants, as I mentioned, involves playing the Nazi card against Israel and its founding movement Zionism. And drawing attention to the consequent harms in such a case, shouldn't be intended or taken as an attempt to suppress criticism of Israel and its military practices. Instead, it's a call not to use particular words. That's all. It's a call not to use particular words, even in the most trenchant criticism, because some words wound. Most people would surely agree with that. And most people would surely agree that that's a very reasonable appeal when they understand the wounds and the hurts involved. That's what we're hoping for, that reasonable appeal will be heard. Well, part of my title was for this talk was about countering anti-Semitic discourse and countering the Nazi card. I'm not going to say much about these because I welcome your views on this, and seminars are working occasions, so I would very much welcome your views and to learn from those about how we actually challenge the Nazi card. I've been very much in favour of criminalising particular forms of hate speech and criminalising hate crimes, but there's little support for that in the United States, little support for that amongst Jewish communal leaders in the UK, and that's really a non-starter, even though we could claim that many of the incidents I've talked about are acts of defamation with their hurtful consequences. There are various other ways of doing it: refutation, arguing against the comparisons and the equations that are made. If you look at the commentary over the Goldsmiths College seminar last week, there's some lovely examples of refutation there on the internet against the speakers. There's regulation, codes of practice and conduct for journalists and newspapers perhaps, education, and the way that we should train and the topics and curricula we might introduce to university students, especially given the particular climate, especially the case in Britain and elsewhere in Europe, the movement to boycott academic connections with Israel. But the thing that interests me most of all is the second point, verbalisation. Because I would argue that as well as words wounding, words can heal. And I would suggest, and I very much welcome your views about this, that the process of articulating these hurts, the process of making such hurts evident, the process of unravelling these hurts, in the type of way that I have done, but in much more detail, the process of pointing out these hurts, begins a process of ameliorating these hurts by demonstrating to others the hurts involved. And I might be very naive about this, but I would hope that articulating such hurts is an appeal to reason. And who could argue against that? Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your comments.
Well, thank you. So, any questions?
Thank you very much for your lecture. I have some maybe strange or interesting questions. First,
sure.
It's I have exactly the same experience in Germany. We have several examples. A few weeks ago, I held a lecture in Czech Republic about the same argument about the Warsaw Ghetto and Comparative Gaza Strip. And in Germany, we have kind of bishops playing this kind of Nazi card, and we have no criminalization of this. So it's mainstream to play this kind of Nazi card. In Germany and in UK also, I think all over Europe.
And there's the Henrik Broder case, the recent case there in Germany as well.
Yeah, exactly. But I have maybe a strange question. maybe Nazi card includes that National Socialism was something bad. Now we have the situation that there is a regime in Tehran, in Iran, they don't think it was bad what the Germans have done. So they are a kind of bridging a gap of pre-Holocaust to post-Holocaust anti-Semitism without dealing with the Holocaust. So they go back to the protocols of the elders of Zion, Ahmadinejad himself. So he's not using. So I think this is a kind of, it's interesting because they are playing. On the other side, there are also Holocaust deniers in the Arab community. They are not Arabs, they are Shias, but the Arabs, they are playing Nazi card. In Gaza Strip, we have now a Holocaust museum on the Gaza Strip, from Hamas in London. So, but this is, I think to reflect on. What does it mean? If the Arabs, they become used to play Nazi card, for decades they have been ordinary Holocaust deniers, but now the last couple of years, especially Hamas and others out of these extremist groups, they are not playing especially the Nazi card like the Western world, the left wing or whatever anti-Zionist groups also do. But Iran doesn't, as far as I see. So maybe it's a point to think about.
Yes, yes. Shall I respond to that, or will we take more questions, Charles? There are many points that I could respond to, perhaps in conversation, would do afterwards. The Israeli exception, I think, is a very interesting one, and I'm not sure what to say about that at this point, to be honest. But the use of the Nazi card by in a political project by surrounding states against Israel and by left-wing opposition against Israel. It's a very powerful discursive strategy, isn't it? Because it brands the target as ultimate evil. And we know what needs to be done with ultimate evil, don't we? And the consequences, if you think it through, are quite serious in terms of that allegation.
Josh?
Yeah, thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. I have a question. Obviously, you're focusing primarily on using comparisons to Nazi practices. But I'm wondering, in your third, I haven't said anything important yet, so I won't repeat. In your third section, where you talk about comparing practices of Israel using the Nazi card there, what if it wasn't a comparison to the Nazis, but a comparison to, say, a delegitimized state, apartheid South Africa? And then, how would that figure into your analysis?
Different, I think different levels of hurt would be triggered, and they would be clearly different instances, because we could argue that many other examples of oppressive regimes, if a person is arguing such, many other examples could be used for those who want to criticise the Israeli state in that way, and why Nazi Germany? That's the question to be asked. And I think we might think of that different regimes would have different kind of iconic status and different hurts that would be inflicted, and the apartheid. The label apartheid is also laden with particular hurts, isn't it? Really, perhaps not on the same scale of playing the Nazi card, but playing the apartheid card clearly triggers particular hurts for people around the world, and it's very clear what's being done there. But we could think of other oppressive regimes where we might think of a descending ladder of hurts that could be used. I think the point is that the Nazi card, obviously, for obvious reasons, has a specific, particular, deeply hurtful resonance where Jews are concerned.
Yeah, and I get that, and I agree, and I guess, and this isn't your study, but your study makes me think of another phenomenon, which is once you get into this harsh criticism of Israel, comparison with other situations, if you just say, well, it's only the Nazi card where we have to consider the hurt, and we're not, then you're sort of suggesting that there's a point at which you have to determine when the discourse becomes hurtful. Because any discourse could be determined. Nazi discourse, I mean, the comparison to Nazi discourse is easy. And then it becomes slippery when you're at a lower threshold.
Yeah, very.
It may or may not be anti-Semitic, and it may or may not matter whether you call it anti-Semitic, but the problem is similar. It's just more slippery.
Yeah. It's very hurtful indeed. If I could just respond to that one, Thomas, because you got really the crux of the issue here, because the hurt is not just it's not a matter of offending sensibilities or offence. So if we used other, we drew comparisons with Mugabe's Zimbabwe. Whatever kind of comparison we might want to draw, we can think of offence and insult caused by using those hurts. Then the crux of the argument is that using the Nazi card, the issue is not offence and insult. By all means, they're inflicted, but it's hurt, and it's the particular hurt. It's those particular harmful consequences with that particular label that's specific to Jews and to Zionists. And that's a different level of, it's about hurt, particular hurt, as against offending sensibilities.
Do you think that the purpose of the Nazi card use is just to cause hurt, or are there goals, or there's a purpose beyond that, that is not just personal or touches the feelings?
Unless I start speculating, and it would only be speculation. I sort of rather use the words of those who defend, mitigate the use of the Nazi card. And as I was saying earlier, Richard Falk, for instance, admitted that he could have been more sensitive, but at the same time he also said that he felt he had to speak loudly to be heard. And other defenders of using this kind of discourse have said similar things, that they have to use this language to be able to get their criticism heard. They feel it's the only way that they can get it heard. Now, we can argue against that. Now, just take it without speculating about their motives, because I think much of the debate has been speculation about the motives of such people, and that will just get us nowhere. Trying to dig around in the minds of such persons, and so I'm trying to take it away from that and look at the consequences of the words they use, and in focusing on the hearts, would suggest how more reasonable can you get than that.
But Paul, if I could add
Sure.
to your response to the question, isn't it important to look at the agenda of the people playing the card? So Iran is very clear. The skinheads or Nazi fascist groups in London, on the east end of London, whatever, their agendas are clear.
Yeah.
So do you take into consideration the agenda and the purpose of this political action?
Not in this particular project, no. Because I think the most, those examples that you just gave are rather clear cut, aren't they? The whole problem, the whole debate about this, are those who are putting themselves forward as advocates, defenders of human rights, supporters of human rights, and so on. So they are working and under the banner of human rights agenda. Now, I think we can only speculate about their agenda, and therein lies the problem, that we get into this war of words. And what we're trying to do is find a way out from that. And it's not just a case of sidestepping it, but we're suggesting it is a potentially constructive way out of that. Because even those who are arguing on the, let's just say, they are genuinely committed to human rights, and they feel that this is the best way that they can have, propose their cause. How can they argue against? And how can they argue in favour of continuing to use such discourse when the hurts of such discourse are articulated to them? That's the argument.
So if I can push you a little further.
Sure.
I think it was Martin Luther King who said he's not worried about the actions of a few bad people, he's more concerned about the inaction of the vast majority of good people. So if the liberal intellectuals using and believing, perhaps genuinely, in the human rights agenda, if the results of not coming to defend Israel against the onslaught of radical Islamicism, not Arabs and not Muslims, but radical Islamicism and their agenda, and the extreme right and the extreme left in Europe, and they're sort of acquiescing, and Israel is sold out. The result of their inaction results in a very clear action. So how would that figure in your analysis?
And are you referring to, within that, Charles, would you be referring to the Nazi card played against other states, like Iran, for instance?
Well, I think the agenda of radical Islamists, radical Sunnis, radical Shiites, Iran, Al-Qaeda, Jihad, Hezbollah, and others, Hamas, they're very clear. And when people like the editor of Race and Class Born and other intellectuals who sort of do a postmodern critique and sort of critique away the reality or ignore a reactionary agenda which is gaining power and strength in the Islamic world, the results of their inaction results has repercussions in Muslim societies and Arab societies and perhaps Israel's future in the region. So their inaction, or they're just focusing on, say, Israeli abuses of human rights, leads to very dire consequences.
Yes.
Directly.
Yes. No, indeed. And there are a number of things there that you said. I'll just unpick a bit, because one of the arguments that you'll be familiar with is that a sort of narrow focus on Israel in terms of human rights criticism. The question is asked, why just Israel, or why primarily Israel? And why not be an equal opportunities critic and single out all sorts of other states? I think that's, I can buy that argument, but I think it's also a tricky argument. Social movements develop, social movements grow. There's a particular social movement around Israel. I can see why some people would focus why they are sort of sole issue advocates. Wouldn't necessarily make them anti-Semitic. Some of those people might have good intentions. Some of them clearly would be anti-Semitic. But I think just having a sole focus in terms of criticism on Israel, I think it can be understood in some cases. But of course, not drawing attention to other human, focusing on Israel at the expense of other nation states is hugely problematic. Indeed, some have used the label Nazi against other states, and context matters. In some circumstances, we might think that the historical allusion is more accurate when it's being used against other states, perhaps Iran, for instance, and the historical memory is clearly very different. So context does matter in this respect.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a little bit of similar question as Josh had. When you said that there can be a criticism that is actually not playing the Nazi card and doesn't have to be anti-Semitic, I was wondering, having lived the past 10 years in the UK, whether you can see that there might be basically a code that actually doesn't need the obvious Nazi card anymore, but functions just in the same way it is understood by now in the discourse as content-wise, it will be the same. You know how I mean that?
There's more than a code. There's a code, and there's far more than that, especially in British academia. I can't name names or name places, of course, but I had a colleague, let's say, sometime in the past. You can see I'm being very woolly about this. Who a senior academic who said to me in conversation, Israelis. It wasn't Israelis. His words were, "The Jews are worse than the Nazis." Let's talk about Israel. Not only acting like Nazis, worse than the Nazis. Can you imagine that? Worse than the Nazis. This is a colleague saying it to another colleague, and for all I know, this person thought, he or she thought I was Jewish. I've sat in staff meetings where we've had an application for a master's programme from a former Israeli police officer, and chuckles breaking out in the selection committee that yes, they want to come and study criminology to learn how to beat up and torture people more effectively. I've sat in the common room and the refectory where it's the consensus is evident, and this is where it comes back to the code here. There's nothing explicit, the consensus is highly evident in the conversation at the dinner table or the lunch table, and to try and stand up and speak out and contradict colleagues in those circumstances is highly difficult. And I'm ashamed to say that on many occasions I was very timid and didn't speak up and speak out against my colleagues when I heard those conversations going on.
Can I ask a follow-up? What would you do in your study with this this context, this discourse that isn't actually, where would it fit in if it isn't the obvious Nazi comparison?
It's really problematic, in terms of finding a way through. I think the All Parliamentary Inquiry report focused a great deal on this topic, this discourse. The Community Security Trust report did. What we're trying to do is here, or we like to think, is it right? Time will tell if the analysis bears out like this. That we've focused on a particularly prominent manifestation of discourse, anti-Semitic or not, a particular prominence of manifestation of discourse. It's a particular problem at the moment, it's a very explicit problem, and that we can clearly address this one by identifying these herds. When we get into the less explicit ones, then we get back into that cul-de-sac of claim and counterclaim, and how do we find a way out of this? We thought we'd start with those that we can knock down. This one's still difficult to knock down, but we'll try and start with this one first.
So just as I'll make a personal comment, somebody who's lived and studied and taught in the UK, we used to talk about being intimidated or speaking timidly. I think the environment is much more difficult than here, and I think people may not appreciate how difficult it is to speak out. So I think your research in that context is so important. I don't know if people should be lost on people here. I don't know.
I was listening to you when you said words can hurt and words can heal. And I think it's very, very important that one should, very much be careful with, what they say and how they say things. And I totally agree with you. But going back to the Nazi card, I was just sitting there thinking, what is the motivation of people that had to generate this new device? And in a way, I think it is going also to what was mentioned about using the apartheid also as another tool. Given the fact that Israel is not an apartheid, there are judges, Arab judges, and there are Arabs in the military. There are problems, definitely, but you cannot see Israel either as a Nazi country or an apartheid. But I think, for me, it looks like there is a motivation behind those initiatives to actually paint Israel in some kind of a demonic way. And as you mentioned before, too, in one of those answers, there is a bias, there is a double standard of judging civil rights issues that are done in Israel to other places in the world. We all heard what happened in China with harvesting organs from living people, etc. So I just, for me, the double standards, the demonization, it seems like, same old, maybe a new shape of the same old basic anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I would agree with you in many instances. The problem with that, though, is that again we get into the realm of claim and counterclaim, and this cul-de-sac. As a person in Iganski, if I could just say a few more words in response to this one, and that is, it's not a new phenomenon. And playing of the Nazi card in this way, we can see it in the media going back to more than 40 years, to 1967, for instance. So, it's over 4 decades old, this phenomenon of labelling the Israeli state in this way. It's certainly not a new thing. Playing the apartheid card is a softer softer variant. And I like to think, well, it sounds odd saying I like to think, but I suspect that some of those who might be more committed to, genuinely committed to concerns about human rights and they themselves recognise the problems and the hurts by using the Nazi card, use the apartheid card instead to try and draw attention to the problem.
I have a question about your criterion of a hurtful consequence as a replacement for an analysis of the intent and all that. And what my concern is that it might backfire. That let's say somebody wants to analyze the roots of Islamic terrorism and they go back to Islamic religious sources. I can just hear somebody saying, well, good, we'll stop using the term Nazi to describe Israel, but then you can't talk about religion as a source of terroristic behavior because it's too hurtful to say something about the Quran, or it's too hurtful to say something about the Prophet. And I'm wondering, where exactly is this going to lead if we start to eliminate speech and police debates on the basis of the hurtful consequences, especially in our hypersensitive society where people are hurt by all sorts of things?
Yeah. I think that's a very good question, and let me say that the argument that I'm putting to you is not an argument for what some call grievance politics. We can think of these hurts as acts of defamation. We can frame these hurts as acts of defamation, and in Britain, under the civil law, that would be defined as untruthful accusations with harmful consequences. Now, we might think of accurate, truthful parallels that can be made, but would still have harmful consequences, and strictly speaking, wouldn't be acts of defamation. And here, very clearly, we're talking about acts, clear acts of defamation.
Follow up that if you're not going to do it through the court system, which you said you were kind of giving up your criminalization,
sure,
then this is not going to be taking place with rules of evidence and with some judge, but rather it's going to become codes of speech, and in the United States, some of those things can become kind of oppressive, and everybody claims everything is untrue, and so then you're not really getting out of your cul-de-sac, but you're back in it arguing about whether it's true or not, or defamatory or not.
Yes. No, I see that's a very important point, but I think empirically documenting empirically. Demolishing the inaccuracies of these kinds of illusions are rather straightforward to do. So the untruthful, inaccurate nature can be documented. So the question I would ask, and maybe this is I'm just exposing my own thinking. I don't have an answer for this because at the heart of this, the question I've always asked myself, and please forgive me by what I'm going to say. And because I don't want to offend anybody here, but as an analyst I think through what if Israel was acting as Nazi Germany? Think about that worst case. Just think about that, and how would we regard such use of discourse then? I'm not sure. But I think that the historical accuracy and the validity is an important matter in treating this as defamation.
I'm interested in the differences in hate crimes between the United States and Great Britain. I worked for the Anti-Defamation League for a number of years and a number of times. And that was one of the organizations that was instrumental in writing model hate crimes laws and helping to get hate crimes laws passed in many of the states. In the United States, speech is protected by the First Amendment. So in the example you gave early in your talk about a Jew calling another Jew a Nazi or anything else, there's nothing that can be done about that in the United States. And I would be the person who would get the call from the person called the Nazi, and I would have to tell that person it's not illegal because it's speech. But if said Jew put a swastika on the door of the other one, then that is criminal because it's vandalism. and it's a hate crime because it's against a protected group of people. How much of the hate speech itself is really taken as a crime? Are the police arresting people for their speech? Are there prosecutions for their speech? Or is it just something that's on the books and not really effective?
Police in the UK, some police forces have been very confused about the matter in the UK because our hate crimes laws are relatively more recent provisions compared to the United States. And there have been...
Those are only about a decade or so old. 1998
was the first one, provisions against racially aggravated offences. And there have been some silly cases where people have been arrested for saying things to their neighbours, and of course the tabloid press reveal these cases and talk about political correctness. Speech can only be prosecuted in the UK as an act of intentional harassment, and so the prosecution would need to prove that the person targeted was in fear of imminent violence, and they'd need to use some objective evidence, a threatening posture of the,
Have there been cases that have been successfully proven?
Quite a number of cases like that. A substantial number. It's a guesstimate about a third of all cases, I think, fall under that category. The type of discourse that I've been talking about here, especially around Israel and Zionism, certainly couldn't be prosecuted under British law, and there's certainly no desire to do so, and especially amongst Jewish communal leaders, there's no desire to do so. There's a strong movement against Holocaust denial laws, for instance, even though the UK is constantly being pulled by the European Union to try and fall in line. There's a strong resistance against it. Just one last thing, because the US case is very important, because our civil servants did some comparative policy analysis, and they did what us academics do. They did comparative policy learning, and they looked at experience in the United States. And what they found was that there are very few prosecutions for hate crimes in the United States. And the problem is, that's because in many instances, the prosecution has to prove motivation. And this is relevant to what I've just said. It's very difficult to prove what was in a person's mind, let alone that what was in their mind motivated their acts. It's very difficult to prove indeed. And you look at courts in general in the criminal law, all sorts of mitigating circumstances are brought in by the defence and accepted by courts. Motivation is very difficult indeed. The new Labour government in 1998 had an alternative route for prosecution of anti-Semitic, racist offenders in general, and for hate crimes it was either motivation or aggravation. So, and most offenders are convicted under this second route, which the offender, it simply has to be approved that the offender uttered racist abuse, I think anti-Semitic abuse at the time, immediately before, during, or immediately after committing the act. And objective evidence has to be proven that those words were uttered. It doesn't have to be proven that they motivated the act. So long as there is evidence that those words were uttered, that's enough to secure conviction. And I think about 90% of the convictions under our hate crime laws are under. And that recognises that it's not the motivating thoughts, not the motivating impulses or the opinions that are at issue, it's the consequences of the act. And the act, with the accompaniment of those sentiments, whether they motivated the act or not, have empirically demonstrable, I demonstrate them in the book, have empirically demonstrable harmful consequences for their victims.
Two quick questions. Ursula, then
I feel one aspect is missing. Nobody says the Gaza Strip is like the Soviet Gulag. The fact that the murderers of 6 million Jews, that the surviving Jews and Israelis in particular are compared with the murderers of Jews, I think is something that should not be underestimated in its effect and in its importance in this discourse. And I also feel, because we all recognize that Nazi Germany is not a legitimate way to go, by using that, Israel is delegitimized.
course.
And I think this is very, very important.
Of course. I perhaps didn't stress that enough in my presentation. We stress that very strongly in our writing. That it's an act of demonisation.
But that
Absolute
the murders
demonisation
of
and
the victims
dehumanitisation.
Are used against the victims, I think is critical in my way of thinking.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I want to continue what we thought a lot said about, and just talk a little bit about the basic assumption of the discourse, that the discourse could wound, that the discourse could heal. So as a psychologist, I really, I give a lot of respect to words, but also to behavior. And I think that, the discipline that really, put too much honor into words is really dangerous, because it's not only about words, and it's not only about emotions. And as a psychologist, I really have a lot of honor to emotions as well, but I think the consequences are much more severe, because it's not only about emotions, it's like biases in judgment, like it creates biases in judgment, and it leads to behavior. And so, and this is the problem, the behavior, the consequences. It's not, and so I wonder, I know that there are some countries that there are limitations in freedom of expression, and maybe this could be a good way to cope with it, because if you start dealing with the motives, it's an endless, it's endless.
Yes.
And so defining words related with Holocaust as out of the law could be maybe and then there's no need to negotiate what was the motive, which is endless and it takes a lot of effort and it's useless eventually. But I really have a specific problem with the discipline that's like the discourse. The discourse is words. So words is just words. And what is, we have reality. People are wounded, people die, people killed, people get, and so we need to treat this.
Yes, and was that the type of behaviour that you're referring to?
Yeah, it's not an attack. I only say that it's like you wounded yourself by using the discourse, putting the discourse as something which is really high value, and then sometimes we can just forget about reality.
Sure. The problem is, in terms of that reality and behaviour, the problem is proving the causal connection between words uttered and people's actions.
So the word could be the behaviour. This is what I say. That once you decide that the word is the behaviour.
That's right. That's right. And that's why framing it as communicative action. But these words, are not only words, not only discourse, but they are acts. These are speech acts. These are acts in themselves. And again, perhaps I should have emphasised that more strongly and say that in the writing, that we're regarding these words as deeds. These are communicative action. These are discursive acts in themselves.
And also there's a famous quote that the concentration camps didn't begin with the bricks, they began with words. So words are very important. So Paul, thank you very much. You really engaged us for a really good seminar. And so happy Thanksgiving. Our next seminar is in 2 weeks with Professor Sion from NYU is coming. She's a young, extraordinary scholar. So hope we can be there the 4th of December.
Yeah.